This week we're going to ask a question nobody else seems to be asking, and that is, why does the Federal Reserve need average Americans to sacrifice our jobs, our wages, and slow our consumption of spending when the federal government clearly is not?
To the Fed's own report, if you continue raising interest rates as you plan, unemployment will be 4.6% by the end of the year, more than a full point higher than it is today. Chair Powell, if you hit your projections, do you know how many people who are currently working, going about their lives, will lose their jobs?
I don't have that number in front of me. I will say it's not an intended consequence.
But it is, and it's in your report, and that would be about 2 million people.
Biden unveiling his sweeping budget proposal, calling for major tax hikes on the wealthy and increased spending.
On this episode, we look at Joe Biden's latest budget proposal and how fiscal policy is actually working against the Federal Reserve's monetary policy, leaving the brunt of slowing inflation on the average American. This is the Backseat Economist. Remember, facts change, but numbers never lie. So the federal funds rate is currently 4.57%. The Federal Reserve last rate hike was 0.25% after several successive 0.5% rate hikes earlier in this year. The smaller increase is based on a lower fourth quarter CPI and PPI report showing signs of lowering inflation. But all that sentiment was changed last week when January CPI only lowered about 0.1% instead of the expected 0.3 to 0.5%. But what really seemed to freak the Fed out was the uncharacteristically high job growth, gaining just over 500,000 jobs in January and now projected in February to be at least 250,000 more added. The jobless rate is expected to hold at a 53-year low at about 3.4%. Average hourly wage growth is expected to rise a moderate 0.3% on the month. However, wage inflation is seen rising to 4.7% from 4.4%. And it's these numbers that made the media and even Jerome Powell seem to opine that they jumped the gun with the lowering of the rate increases. The question nobody seems to be asking is, why is a slower job market, lower wages, and higher unemployment the target and weather vane for the Fed as to how well inflation is being reined in? The economic definition of inflation is too much currency chasing too few goods. So how could people who are working, assisting in the creation or themselves creating and delivering goods and services that are actually being purchased, the contributing factor worth focusing on in this economy when that is currency only being transferred and circulated by demand? In other words, no for-profit business is giving away goods and services without charging per transaction, and no consumer is paying for goods and services without having actually purchased and received their product. Now, we fully understand the generally undeveloped and unscrutinized thought process behind this, which is that more jobs means more money in more people's pockets. It also means that industry is hiring because they consider the need for more labor as a result of expected continued higher demand for their product, all of which, by the book, increases the money supply and therefore then prices. But what about the $6.27 trillion elephant in the room? That's right, federal spending. And in 2022, it was 25% of our nation's GDP, meaning government spending was a quarter of the entire U.S. economy's spending. And of that amount, 1.38 trillion was completely fabricated, aka deficit spending, aka money being created without a good or transaction backing it up. There isn't a bigger spender of money not backed up by a creation of goods than the U.S. government, and yet somehow talks about slowing down that source of consumption are non-existent. If you need more proof other than just your everyday eyes, take a look at our widening trade deficit. This is a measure of how much the U.S. economy imports versus exports, creates versus consumes. As the government deficit spends more, our trade deficit seems to widen. This is because we are not domestically manufacturing the goods the government or the local economy consumes with these new dollars in circulation. Take a look at the positive correlation between the two deficits. There's clearly demonstrating the effect that as one goes up, so follows the other. So we issue debt to create US dollars to then be majority spent overseas, thereby increasing the US dollar supply without the benefit of at least being the supplier of such purchases. Now, Joe Biden has proposed a $6.8 trillion increase in spending with hopes of making up for it with new taxes on the so-called rich. At the same time they hope to generate this new revenue based on taxes from income, the Federal Reserve is trying to fight the problem of too much money in our system by increasing rates. Now, they hope that by increasing these rates, they will slow employment, lower wages, and yes, actually initiate recessionary conditions. The higher interest rates also strengthen the US dollar, which ends up cutting the knees out of US manufacturers who have survived up to this point. Because as our currency increases in value, we are relatively now making our goods more expensive to consume by foreign currencies. This can be seen in the Producers Manufacturing Index, which records the rate at which manufacturers receive and fill orders. Now on this index, a score above 50 indicates manufacturing is in an expansionary phase. At 50, it is neutral, and below 50, it is in a contractionary phase. We are currently hovering in the 47s. How can the Fed pursue its policy, hoping to initiate higher unemployment, lower wages, and slow job growth, while the Biden proposal get what it wants, which is higher spending funded by higher income taxes? The answer is they can't. Clearly, the two policies are diametrically opposed. They cannot generate more tax revenue in recessionary conditions. Therefore, we will not be able to actually fund the extra spending they are actually proposing in the new budget. So when this extra spending does take place, the result will be more deficit spending and more rate hikes to control the inflationary effects of that spending. This will eventually rein in inflation, but it'll be at a very painful cost to me, you, and the average American consumer. And until we demand fiscal responsibility for the federal government and for them to actually behave in the country's best interest, the root of this problem will go unaddressed. Years of quantitative easing and federal deficit spending is what put us in this mess. That is why we have so much currency chasing too few goods. So while I fully believe that we do need to overhaul our tax system and we do need to start generating more tax revenue because of the exponential increase in spending that our federal government consistently demands in the budget, I also believe that we need to reduce that spending. We have to find a way to reduce that spending. And funding proxy wars, welfare programs, increasing tax credits for green energy deals, all are opposed to actually reducing the deficit. Now, you might hear Joe Biden claim he has reduced the deficit by some $1.7 trillion, and that is true, but that is only true because it is in comparison to the massive amount of deficit spending we had to take on during the COVID years. So 2020, any government and every government is now spending less compared to 2020. So it's a completely false comparison. Growing up, my father always used to talk about writing or calling the local representative, right? Your local congressman, your local senator. And I always used to laugh at him about it. But in order to avoid another, say, January 6th, I think the only way we can get these people to start acting in our best interest and their constituents' best interest is to actually start doing that. And hopefully these videos and social media can help spur that on as well. Until next time, everybody, Backseat Economist out.